See, it's part of the duck and weave. I haven't heard you complain about Gray Byram in 3 days. All right, I'm going to call to order the work session for March 8th, 2016. Um, and the topic is comprehensive plan. We do have a quorum. And I know Commissioner Hunt is on his way. He was stuck in traffic. He did call me. Um, I'll take a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
All those in favor? Okay. So at this time, we will turn it over to Mr. Dennis Rory and Lori Oakley to lead us in a discussion on the comprehensive plan.
Thank you. Today we're kind of going to tag team the presentation. I'll do the first half, and then Lori will hop in, do maybe the back half, and then we'll kind of tackle any questions jointly. But just wanted to start out with maybe the purpose of why we're here today for the work session. The title kind of makes it a little bit obvious, but it's an update on where we are with the comprehensive plan. This is something that's been going on for a little over a year now. We're right at the year mark or so, and as it approaches closure, we thought it'd be a good idea to give the board and the public at large an update on where we are. So that's the why we're here. Just a bit in terms of kind of what we're going to accomplish today, or hopefully accomplish today. Just define the comprehensive plan again to refresh everybody's memory on what this document is, why it's important. Go through kind of what I'll call a project overview, or kind of how we got here. What are some key recommendations from the comp plan? The comp plan, you'll hear it shorthand for comprehensive plan, so if I use those two things interchangeably, hopefully everybody will kind of catch that it's the same meaning. Kind of third bullet, we'll go through key recommendations from the comp plan. It has what I'll call a significant number of key recommendations that are noted throughout the different chapters. Won't try to cover all of those in the context of this update. I'll just pull out some key ones, and actually Lori, she'll highlight the key ones. If you want to talk about any of them, whether they're in the document or on the slide, feel free to ask questions, and then talk a bit about the path forward. So just as a reminder, kind of what is a comp plan? This definition is pulled directly from the second draft, but at a very high level, it's a community, what I'll say visioning statement, or visioning document rather than statement, and it's a where are we as a community, where do we want to go as a community, and there's a bit about how we get there, and so that's why you'll hear terms like vision and blueprint kind of used throughout the document, maybe even throughout this presentation, because it's really intended to set up a collective community vision around key areas that are important to the community, and also get into a little bit about how we can move the needle forward with respect to that vision. And here are the 8 key areas that are covered in the comprehensive plan. I won't read them all out, but what I do want to note about this slide is these aren't these are the community's values. These aren't any one individual person or entity's values. This is a collective set of values that the community has identified are important in terms of recognizing where as a town do we want to go. Again, land use, growth management, that's pretty obvious, and we talk a lot about that as it relates to some development activity that we deal with throughout the Development Services Department specifically, but the town broadly. Parks and Recreation, Economic Development, and the others that are up on the board. So why is a comprehensive plan important? You know, I tend to do this in just about every presentation that I come before you all, to really try to put some concrete definition or a framework around why are we even doing this, other than it's a nice document to have. Well, again, a strategic vision and document. So having an idea where we want to go, if we have an idea of what the target we're trying to hit is, or targets that we're trying to hit are, then it allows us to ensure that we're moving in that direction or in those directions if there are multiple targets as it relates to the different focus areas that I brought up earlier. So that's a pretty key why, in my opinion. Without that vision, at times we could be moving in divergent directions that are forcing us to make some pretty tough choices that may not align comprehensively with the community's vision. Again, it's definitely a value statement document about where the community's values are, and I use community very broadly here. That's individuals in this room. That's our elected officials. That's our citizens throughout the town. That's folks who own businesses here in town. But I use that very broadly to say it's meant to encompass everyone who makes up the Waxhaw community. I think it's very important that it also is intended to establish a framework for future decision making as it relates to land use and development. So it allows the board in particular to answer questions about, are we moving in an intended direction on the topic of development and growth as it relates to our comp plan. If it is, some can view that as, job well done. If it's not, it's an opportunity to evaluate, is the comp plan consistent with where the market is heading, and do we want to make any sort of adjustments for what the market is telling us? But again, it provides that framework for decision making. And then the fourth thing, which there's a legal piece to it that says, as it relates to our zoning regulations and specifically our UDO, the current one that we have and the one to come, our zoning regulations shall and should be in accordance with our comp plan. So there should be a link between the two documents. So those are four kind of high-level reasons why this is an important document, and we would go through the time, effort, and expense to move forward with it. So an overview, kind of how did we get to this point? I won't go through all of the details of every single step that has occurred along the way, but the three graphics that are before you, the one on your far left, or the left on the screen if you're looking on a smaller screen, is really to show who all had input into how this document was shaped. This wasn't a single staff-led effort around developing a planning level document. This was really a community design, community developed plan, and these are all of the entities that I could determine that had direct access to Benchmark, who was the consultant who really served as a scribe, for lack of a better word, to write down and document what the community has said. That their direction wasn't necessarily to set direction for the town. It was to understand, absorb, synthesize the information that was provided to them and put it in a format to where we could use it. So first half of 2015, there was several kind of public engagement and involvement components, some workshops, some charrettes, things of that nature. Probably towards the middle to third quarter of last year, the first draft document was developed. It was sent out to staff and distributed out to the community as well and stakeholders around October of last year. That some feedback was given to the consultant. They produced a second draft with which several members on the board have provided some feedback on that second draft, which came in February, which leads us to kind of where we are today. And so we now have a second draft that's been it's been drafted. We've provided some feedback, and it will now kind of next steps be on Benchmark to take that feedback, incorporate it into the comp plan, some of that feedback incorporated into the comp plan, so that we can start to finalize the document. Let me pause right there because I've said a lot, and we're about to transition over to some of the key recommendations. Are there any questions on kind of what the document is, how we got here, any of those types of kind of process procedural questions? Okay. Well, we'll transition over. I'll let Lori Oakley come up here and give us kind of a high-level overview of some of the key recommendations from each one of those 8 focus areas.
Mayor, Board of Commissioners, as Dennis stated, I'm just going to touch on a few of the key recommendations. The comprehensive plan is broken down into 8 different sections. You've read through it, you know that there's pages in each of the sections of recommendations. So just to touch on a few from each section, we'll start with land use. First one, prioritize and incentivize annexations. I think I've heard Warren mention in a couple of meetings and talked about this one in particular, especially recognizing that we've got property right now on the fringe of Waxhaw that's developing under Union County. They're basically going to be using our services, but they're developing under Union County. So what can we do to get those folks into the town? Also implement by right form of regulations. This is what we're talking about now as we're going through the UDO rewrite of a more form-based or a hybrid form-based code. Switching over to transportation, develop an updated transportation plan. I believe Dennis talked about that at the board retreat with you. And also to enhance connectivity. That's key and essential not just for residential projects, also for non-residential projects, having that connectivity between the different projects. Economic development. Several develop an economic development strategy. Continue to develop the Main Street program. Kurt and his several committees are doing a good job on that right now. Municipal services and infrastructure, develop a joint wastewater master plan, and also establish a stormwater utility, which I believe when Greg was here, I think it was last year, we briefly looked at that stormwater utility, and again, Dennis mentioned it at the previous or the recent board retreat. Parks and recreation, just to continue to implement the projects that were in previous plans, particularly the Parks and Rec Master Plan, to require developers to donate park and recreation facilities. And of course, I got to talk about building out our greenway system. I don't know how many of you have been out to see the new Carolina Thread Trail Bridge in Millbridge. I got out there last week. It's pretty awesome. Natural resources, oversee a sediment and erosion control activity. Again, these are all projects on Dennis's radar. Also to create open space requirements for developers. Historic preservation, to create a work program for the Historic Preservation Commission. They're currently reviewing facade improvement program grants. They're also reviewing certificate of appropriateness for local landmarks. They've got several activities on their current agenda. And to also establish educational materials to help property owners rehab historic properties. Obviously, we got to talk about the Duncan McDonald House and the work that's being done on it. Another one that comes to mind is the one behind the Women's Club that was rehabbed. Great projects that are happening or have recently happened. And lastly, cultural resources, to expand cultural programming outside of our downtown. We have a lot going on in our downtown area. And also establish a local artist public appreciation campaign. And again, those are just a few highlights. Again, there are several pages in each section of the comprehensive plan, and also there's an implementation section in the back of the comprehensive plan. I think one of the largest recommendations was, of course, land use. I think it recommended right now all of the recommendations under land use, but it also had recommendations from all of the other sections also. So if you have any questions from me, I'll be glad to answer them, just touching on some of these key recommendations before we move into the timeline. Okay.
Thanks. So I touched on this a little bit earlier in terms of the overall schedule. You can kind of view it for yourself, kind of where we've been, maybe where we are, and the upcoming items. The last two kind of blocks on this graphic, would indicate what's upcoming. The asterisks are there just to really highlight that these are anticipated. There's the potential that April, some of this information could go to the planning board in April, so there's potential that the schedule could move a little bit quicker. But one thing that we want to not be careful with, but be conscious of, is that there are still comments, mainly clarifying comments, that need to be adjusted by the consultant. So we had to build time into that schedule between now and when it ultimately comes before the full board for official approval and adoption in the May-June timeframe. Questions?
So how do we want to discuss this and deliberate this? You got feedback.
I did.
It spanned all spectrums.
I did.
I don't mind starting it. When I look again at the plan that we have before us, I'm reminded of Mr. Prosser at our retreat, kind of telling us to pick our subjects carefully and try to make sure we don't bite off more than we can chew. I think that there's a lot of information in the comprehensive plan as a part of the committee that got that. A lot of work went into it. It's still not quite what I'm used to seeing as a comprehensive plan or a master plan, and that was part of my comments to you. I would think that perhaps we should pick which part of this comprehensive plan we want to work on first. Which one, let's set a priority. Which section of the plan is the most important to us, and try to get that done. And quite frankly, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I don't see us having this whole document to the planning board by May. Okay? I mean, this is, to borrow somebody else's terminology, this is the brochure that we hand out to people coming to Waxhaw. This is something that's just as important, more important than a 3-page brochure that the committees come up with. If we don't have this thing right, that somebody can pick it up and say, these guys really have their act together when it comes to land use, I think I can see my project here. And I'm concerned about the development ordinance, and we have to have something in here that shows that, okay, we're working on different things. It's as much of a marketing document as it is a comprehensive plan.
Okay.
Well, I think I got the award for the longest note that went back to you, Dennis, and Warren, and to the board. And I preface it by saying there's a lot of good content in here.
Okay.
What I found it to be lacking in, and you said something in your presentation that hit me. I wasn't aware, or I didn't capture throughout the last year that Benchmark was playing more of a role of scribe. And as a result, when I looked at the presentation and saw the participants, not a one of those participants are policy experts. And as a result, what's lacking in here is I believe, the policy direction from the board, the real heavy stuff that's going to make this a living document that sets direction. It's great to say, hey, go build an economic development plan and you're the throat we're going to choke. But that's not that doesn't give him any guidance, any direction, or for that matter, you could go through all of this. And so where my head gets to is that falls back on us. That as a board, we're going to have to champion the effort to get this structured to where the policy aspect comes out, gets discussed by us, and some of the supporting content gets woven in. Otherwise, this reads like I kidded Mr. Fisher and Mr. Cook. I said it looked like their ERC work plan here in the economic development part, not a policy direction for economic development. That's where I struggled. The same, with no disrespect, I felt the historic preservation, Parks and Rec. We were putting out there some things that are in the master plan, but we weren't really putting stakes in the ground on some policies around what do we really mean by we want to create open space? What do we really mean we want to connect greenways? What do we really mean that we're a walkable community? Actually, stuff that we give you that your transportation engineer has to go figure out what that multimodal plan is. I think development, there isn't much of a policy statement in there as to what we want from scale to character to where we want, what kind of density, etc. I think we have some work to do as a board to get to the real meaty structure so policy flows out. I took the time Wednesday, Thursday to actually go and look at 4 or 5 communities and how do they keep it as a living document. And each one of them came back to, even though each one of them implemented a little bit differently, each one of them came back to that they had to get vision and policy to what you said up front. This is a vision document that coalesces your policies that articulate that vision, and the real work is work to be done over the next 15 years, so to speak. Matthews doesn't have a comprehensive plan, but they have two comprehensive planning areas because of where they sit, and those are living documents. Been in existence for one for 5, the other for 7, and they update them continuously. Raleigh, they have 7, 8 amendments a year to their document. If you look at where we came from, we never touched our original comprehensive plan, no amendments made to it. So that's where I had indigestion. That could have been from the 6 Diet Cokes I was drinking at the time too, but that's where I got to as I was going through and looking, comparing and contrasting, and how do we really take this, and I think that falls on us in some way, shape, or form to really work as a team to get it to where it needs to.
Glad you said all of that. I agree in the policy area that there's more needed, and also in a couple of other areas, and I've already voiced my opinion on some of those. I won't go into it again, where I think maybe maybe there's more insight into what we're recommending in some areas here that may not be the right direction.
So following along with what you just said, I guess it was my understanding or my belief, I guess, that we were hiring Benchmark to obviously work with the plan, but then to implement, or to give us, not implement, but to give us some of these policies on how to make some of this stuff work. And from what I'm hearing, I guess that's not what they were doing, or not what we had intended, or not what they were doing.
I was just going to say, I can't say that they weren't doing it, and I'm not sure how much direction we gave them in terms of what is a policy for us, et cetera, and I don't know where.
I think that's how I would characterize it. From my perspective, I would be cautious on any sort of absolute statement around, what we're given versus what we've received versus what we gave them in terms of feedback. Again, I think this slide, if you just kind of step back for a second and look at how many different entities or groups had direct lines of feedback to one group who was trying to consolidate information. That's a decent amount to take in, try to prioritize, and fit into a usable document. One thing I will note, just in some of the feedback that I heard, one of and I'll let Warren jump in at any time if I'm kind of getting this wrong. But one of the best places to establish policy direction is through budget development process, and so what that means is it relates to the comp plan, and I think there was an open space example that was mentioned. I don't think that it's uncommon that you would find in a comprehensive plan that a municipality wants or is trying to attain or achieve a goal of having more open space. I think the next step in that kind of process or train of thinking is, well, how much open space? What do we need to put in place to get to that open space? And you can have some comprehensive plans that will get you that level of detail. You have others that's not the intent. Their intent is just to acknowledge kind of, here are the high level goals. Open space. Now, through something like a budget development process, well, how can we get to 20-30%? Okay, if 30% is the goal, do we need to amend any ordinances? Do we need to adopt any other types of regulations to help get us there? Is there cost associated with that? That's really a conversation, I would say, maybe between manager then and the board on how does a budget get developed to achieve an actionable item in terms of 30% open space, which is a complete example number that I'm throwing out, just trying to help illustrate the point that it's not uncommon that you will have a comprehensive plan that doesn't have all of the specific policies outlined.
So in other words, the comprehensive plan is there, the policies then come along with implementing parts of the plan, like you said, in a budget type scenario, that if we do want to attack this portion of it this year, then we create a budget, we let the manager do that through his staffing.
Well, I would
No,
think,
I think it's bigger than that. I mean, I think the financial side is a part of it, but part of what has to come out in a comprehensive plan is some direction. So he goes and builds a 5-year and a 10-year capital improvement plan. It's not just that annual budget and what we're going to attack this year. It has to be, if we're talking multimodal transportation, he's got to start putting money aside for sidewalks and greenways and all that kind of stuff. And that gets to some directional aspect. It's not just the annual part of it.
well, yeah, I mean, I would add to it. I mean, the comprehensive plan, it can outline several items that are important to a community. So let's say there's 20 items that are important from a land use perspective that are identified in the comp plan. Okay, there's no real sense of timing on when do we get those? How do we prioritize that? I don't necessarily view that prioritization piece as the role of a comprehensive plan. I would indeed view that more as a staff board, a staff manager board type of decision making, because quite frankly that prioritization can be impacted by budget. So before those types of decisions get made, that's where the manager would need to be engaged, the board would as well, to start setting those priorities. I would caution us to allow a consultant group to set those priorities for us outside of some staff direction. And what I'm hearing from Commissioner Hunt, I think I'm trying to address your question about, what maybe is the difference. So the comp plan in itself is a policy, to get back to your original question. It's a pretty overarching one, and then within the respective 8 kind of focus areas, you tend to have some policy direction around those as well. And what do you take on first, and when do you take it on? That prioritization piece, it's been my experience at least that there's a lot of staff involvement, staff board involvement with sorting out those priorities.
I agree.
There's a couple comments I'd like to make, and one is, we need to recognize where we are with this and how we got here. And we can look at it negatively, blame, with blame and all that, or we can look at it as we've all learned a lot, and we're actually at a place where we should have been before we started the comprehensive plan process. When it began, I mean, David's here, we worked with Benchmark, we had, committee, and there was not any real clear direction in any person's mind, including this board, or the comprehensive plan, or the planning board, as to where we needed to go. And I think we've gotten that now. So I think we need to recognize that we've done the plan for the plan, so to speak, and now we take it from here. And to me, what you're saying is, and I agree, let's prioritize. But we need to, amongst ourselves, determine what's step number one, what's step number two. And, the lesson we learned from Mr. Prosser at the retreat. Otherwise, we'll be doing like we did 12 months ago, 13 months ago, kind of learning as we went along. And quite frankly, to have gotten to this is pretty good. But now we need to, finish it. But we're going to have to finish it in a step-by-step way.
I agree. I think that a comprehensive plan, in my mind, when I hear comprehensive plan and then I read through what we have thus far, and I think this is a very good document as a start, but I think that it should dictate policy in areas of housing, land use, utilities, recreation, those kind of things.
Yeah, I agree with you, Brenda. And I think another thing we ought to recognize is that I think Benchmark's done what we asked them to do. And if we didn't give them the right questions or the right direction to begin with, we can't. And this is not to find fault, is that we had to discover this ourselves. Here we are. They did the best job they could do under the conditions. And,
I would offer, from a staff perspective, especially Commissioner Stewart, when to your feedback about the plan should do more dictating of policy, the housing policy in particular, or at least an example you used. I would offer that that's definitely where, if you look again at kind of this kind of feedback loop, that would involve much more board involvement, because when you start to really dictate policy level items, that starts to sort out who leads a lot of that dialogue, quite frankly. The board would be, quite frankly, setting the policy direction and what's important, and then again someone can document how it's important, what's important, how's it important, what's the priority order. But in terms of who's going to be the most vocal group, I think from a staff perspective that would be the board definitely being much more vocal than, I will say, maybe a steering committee who, as I understand it, was probably a lot more vocal in the earlier stages of getting the project up and off the ground.
So there's 4 here that we've talked about at the retreat: land use, transportation, municipal services / infrastructure, and economic development, that are kind of core. How would you like us, or what would you recommend for us, the best way for us to be vocal to get to the policy level?
I would say, as a start, I've gotten different feedback from different board members that represent different interests. I would say a start would be, what's maybe the board as a collective group, what's the board's goals, objectives with the comprehensive plan as a collective group. I still have the very specific items that are out there, and I think from a communication flow that would obviously go through Warren, and he and I can sit down and go through it. But what that does is starts to set very clear board direction on where you would like to see the comprehensive plan go from here. I'm cautious to not direct the consultant group to start amending certain sections of this document based off of one board member's feedback or another, because I think that just would not be appropriate for me to do that as a staff member. But the collective feedback. Here's what we want it to do as a group, and then let staff work on getting the comprehensive plan to do that. Is that helpful? Does that create more confusion?
Kind of ducks it, but,
Tell me
but
how does it
I guess, how do we get that input? So you got from 3, obviously all spectrum, so that didn't really
what
meet the mark. What's the best way for us to get
Because the-
collective board input on, in a prioritized way or sequenced way for you?
Let me step back. So the feedback that I heard from the different board members, it wasn't collective feedback. It was different.
Correct.
They represent
Right.
So I heard more direction, more policy direction around the topic of housing. I've heard, well, kind of just more policy direction in general. I've also heard some feedback about, well, this is, we kind of have received what we may have told the consultant group to give us. So I think documenting in an email similar to what you sent out, where you were very specific about different topics of the or different areas of the comp plan that could use some work. What are the high level goals from a board perspective for this comp plan? Is it to set, prioritize policy direction in all 8 of these different areas? If so, please communicate that. Because if so, that's a completely different conversation that we as staff need to have with anyone working on the comp plan. I have not received that direction since I've been here, so.
Can I give an example?
Sure.
Where I think it is clear, crystal clear in a number of areas. And I'll give you some examples here. So, under land use, it says this is a quote, the form of future growth in Waxhaw will provide an urban contrast to the suburban and rural character of Union County neighborhood municipalities. What that says is density. We don't want to be like Marvin. We don't want to be like Weddington. We want an urban environment in terms of density. Think UDO. That's the document. So here's some direction. That's the document that comes out in. Another example. Moving to a by right form-based framework for land use. Crystal clear. Form-based, by right. That will translate into less going to the board with the conditional use process. That will come out again in the UDO. And I'm assuming that the board is okay with these things because these are crystal clear laid out. Eliminate long public processes. Those sorts of things. So land use, I think in some other areas too.
Several of them, what you just mentioned, are up there.
Pretty clear, and that's the direction under which the UDO is being developed. So this would be, if as an example, there are issues with the majority of the board with those sorts of things, I would think, we talk about prioritizing what we're going to work on first. Land use needs to be tackled absolutely.
I would agree.
Because we're already, to some degree, using the growth sector map because it's the most recent, up-to-date tool we have in making decisions. So, I think under the land use side and really some of the other areas, there's some pretty crystal clear direction that you won't find specific policies, putting those things into place in this document, but there will be other documents that come along that this is the guiding document for the vision of the town, and that will be created through other documents. UDO, for example. That's one that kind of sticks out in my mind.
So just take it a step further. You've said that Studio Cascades come back and said, what's in there doesn't cut it, or doesn't quite cut it. So they got some work to do. He's got to write a transportation plan. Kurt's rewriting the economic development section. So maybe I'm a minority of one, but I'm trying to figure out what it is that's in here that's people are finding. You're already saying that this doesn't quite cut it, but
I think in a lot of areas it does cut it. It's a good starting place, and I don't think it.
but if we're going to approve it, and the planning board's going to approve it,
Here's
what we haven't gotten back from staff is, where does it need help? Where do you guys think it works, and where doesn't it work? You just asked for our input.
Well, Well, I mean, I would say from my perspective, I mean, this, the majority, if not the entire presentation, for me, wasn't necessarily built around deficiencies of the comp plan. It was more so, here are key recommendations. There are things from it we can pull out and move forward with, and we're doing it, as kind of Warren mentioned, on the UDO side. So, you know, I at least haven't necessarily been conveying that it's an extremely deficient document by any means.
Didn't mean to imply that. It's just,
Right.
since you're asking us for policy, it's not clear, at least for me, where you think it's working, where
What-
where it isn't working, in the midst of you writing 3 or 4 new documents. That's the confusion part, for me.
Yeah,
I may be a minority of one.
And I don't know they say it's not working, it's just that right now we don't have policies or ordinances in place to make this happen. Is that what we're getting at? That as we look at these things, we need these ordinances to go in line with these recommendations as we go down through these recommendations. If we want to prioritize and incentivize annexations, how do we do that? What's the policies we need to put in place to make that happen? Which we don't currently have, or that we do have and need to tweak.
You wouldn't find that in.
Right,
That's
but we need to,
correct.
we need to develop those
That's correct.
ordinances.
That's correct.
Commissioner Fitzgerald.
What I view as this document is not the full foundation of a house. That's the way I look at things, building, okay? It's probably 1 or 2 walls of that foundation. We have other parts of that foundation, UDO, and other parts that have to fit together to make that house stable. So I think that it's a starting point, but I don't think it can be encompassing everything, because it's going to be a working document too. It's going to have to be a working document because of our growth factor.
I completely agree with that, Paul. All I'm reacting to is, what help do you need? Because my interpretation, maybe it's incorrect, is that a comprehensive plan consolidates in one place the policy areas that drive Waxhaw forward, or a town forward. And that's where I found it lacking. Perhaps my definition is wrong, and I stand corrected. I understand what was written in the book.
Could you, it may help if you would define what your definition is. It may help us all better understand, so
Let
that
me ask a different question, but maybe
we're
this,
speaking with the
Okay.
same terms.
when you talk about recommendations, are the recommendations different from a policy? Or are they the beginning of a policy?
In here, we did the beginnings.
The beginning of a
That's what
policy.
happened, 'cause this is the
So,
definition, and then
what
you
I'm-
develop vehicles.
Right, that's where I'm going, is how we get to this. So we have recommendations that we like, so we take the recommendation and develop from it a policy. And the policy, or policies, right. And again, we're probably going about this a little backwards because of our learning as we go, but that's how we're gonna get there. We take the recommendations we like, we develop policies, and go from there. And then the rest of this document flows from it. Is that,
I think that's accurate, and if I got us off course, I apologize. I think any kind of comments here about policies were really maybe in response to questions. For me, wasn't necessarily a call for that policy direction. I was hearing that maybe the document was lacking in that regard, and so I was trying to kind of respond to how does maybe this document connect to other things. And Commissioner Burrow, when you mentioned taking some of the recommendations, building some policies around them, that's what starts to get into the budget development process, because you're starting to prioritize what you want to take on first, and that's
what I'm
That's how I
trying to
think
get
it's all
at too,
connected.
Dennis, is where does this group start? And I think we're gonna start with the recommendations. And from there, we go to policies, which incorporate budgetary considerations and others. And they, the land use, we all agree, is number one. You're actually working on several things that affect that.
I would offer that the board has already started on some of these.
I agree with you.
And so, I would maybe encourage you to applaud the fact that in several areas you've already started, made some pretty big decisions several weeks back around priorities. A lot of the work that I've been working on maybe the engineering side of what I do in my role is in response to, quite frankly, information that's come out of the comp plan, information that we've had a lot of dialogue about and has been prioritized at least through this current kind of budget development process. So that's you're already doing it in a lot of different areas, quite frankly.
And recognizing that, if we all agree that land use is our priority, and we, as a board and a group, finish land use, then we've learned how to do the next one.
Which the finishing
One.
the UDO is probably the biggest thing you could do to touch any one of positively
Absolutely.
impact any one of the recommendations out of the land use section.
Probably some other sections.
Sure.
It'll economic development as well. It's all interconnected.
They're all interconnected.
I guess I would view this, the comprehensive plan as the fabric of Waxhaw, and whichever one of these we pull is a thread that weaves throughout it every which way.
And they're all gonna
It touches every one of them, weaves through it.
Right.
No matter what we touch, no matter what we grab, and if we address it in that fact, that, okay, we're going to hit land use first, but land use then affects
All the,
natural resources at the bottom.
we have to start somewhere,
That's correct.
and we have to get something finished so that it's finished, and we learned how to do the next one, and the next one, and the next one.
Warren.
Perfect example that under transportation, enhanced connectivity. Well, you will see elements of that in the UDO. So
That's correct.
all these things start playing together. And I was wondering if this isn't a good idea, just let me know. But
It's not a good idea.
in that studio cascade, they're on board, they're knee deep into the UDO, they actually do this kind of work. I wonder if it would be of value to have them come in and bite this off in chunks and facilitate conversations about, and that will help them in their work on the UDO. Now, sure, let our grants go under that because we need to move forward. But
And I think what you're touching on there is, again, what I think I heard the mayor from to begin with, the group that came together to create this document, none of them were policymakers. And if we've got experts that create policies to make these things happen, I think that would behoove us to listen to what they have to say is, hey, you want to work on, again, a policy for prioritizing annexations. This is a policy that we've seen, we've used, that will work in communities we've used before. Here's how it works. What do you all think? And we vote on it. We go with it.
I mean, and Warren, I mean, it's a great idea, and we've had a lot of those, I'll say, internal conversations between development services and planning staff. No, it's a great idea. It's great. But we've had those. We've just been careful not to move any of that forward and get out ahead of the board's direction on that, quite frankly.
So Commissioner Stewart.
I just want to say, like I said before, this document, I think it's a good document, and it's a good start. And leading into policy and also the UDO and all the things that are interwoven that we're all going to be making decisions on. But I hear a lot of less going through the board. We better make darn sure that we get this right. Because, and I'm not talking about who sits in these seats. I'm talking about whomever sits in these seats for the future. We need to get this right. All of it, as is interwoven together.
I agree.
So, let me see if I've got this. And maybe I'm confused with the arrow chart, the path forward aspect of it. As is, it's a working document, and by and large, most of the sections need policy work. And what you're really saying is that there's probably enough to go on for the staff to come back and work with the board section by section to, in Commissioner Stewart's words, let's start getting these things right. But there's enough for staff to proceed. It's not so much we're approving a comp plan as much as we're approving a way forward when we get to the point in June. and we're going to take them section by section, if you will, or if a couple of sections tie together, that's fine. Is that kind of what you're saying? So we're hitting Commissioner Stewart's point, Commissioner Burrell's point, and your point.
That's certainly what we can do. The original intent was we're at a point to where the comp plan, we have enough information in the comp plan to move forward and start having some dialogue around what do we want to prioritize and how. So earlier in the presentation, this was about 2006 or June of 2016 rather, is very much about how do we bring this comp plan kind of writing to a completion so that we can say that we've updated that, and if we need to tweak it over time, we certainly can. But I've heard a lot of dialogue, quite frankly, today around policy and those topics, and so yes, we can do different policy type of work around that to hit on what you just mentioned, Mayor. But this is not Dennis saying we're requesting more policy direction. This is Dennis responding to the feedback that I heard today, quite frankly. So when you're asking me what am I maybe looking for from the board as it relates to the schedule, what was I meaning earlier in the presentation, it was really about conveying information on here's where we're headed in terms of completing the comprehensive plan.
I think we've gotten to a point where we recognize that amongst ourselves, we are not policy wonks. Okay, we have access to them. Thank you for bringing it up. We've gotten on the beach. You know, we've made it that far. The Marines have gotten us there. Now we need to go with the other kind of work, get off the beach and carry on with what we're doing. And to Brenda's point, we need to proceed as carefully as we can to make sure that what we put in this document and then the UDO reflects exactly what we want to be here in Waxhaw, so that somebody in Massachusetts or California picks us up with development in mind, sees exactly what to expect, and they make the choice and they come here. So,
Agree.
so where do we go from here?
Context you give Cascade, that's the director that cabinet put a plan of work together, and it would be in addition to currently see all what it leads into what they're doing, but to really walk us through, break these things up, have a workshop, really digging in. And a good thing about using them, they're a fresh set of eyes. So that's a good, we can do that, bring it back to the board for your consideration.
And they'll actually be here next week, all next week, but not for this purpose. It's really for the UDO purpose, but we can have the conversation with them ahead of time, but they'll actually be here in person. We can have that dialogue in person or in person rather.
Would it be of value, since they're gonna be here next week, I won't put no meeting on it, but would it be of value to have an hour-long meeting with them, just so you can get some back and forth, this is what we're really looking for with this, where we'd like to go? I mean, since they're gonna be here.
Yeah.
Uh,
But the very first meeting, I think, is the 15th at 1 o'clock or something like that.
That's correct.
an hour outside.
That's correct. Okay, we can do that.
We'll have a special meeting for an hour, so.
The only other thing that if you're giving it some direction back to benchmark,
Sure.
I do believe that first section, which is really the, for lack of a better way to say it, I think you were saying the marketing or the commercial about Waxhaw. I think,
It's the executive summary section.
well,
Something.
I guess that's what you would call it. It's, I think we could all give you some input to try to improve that. So,
Okay.
so an executive from a company or the county or whatever looks at that and says, wow, this is Waxhaw.
Okay.
It really comes alive. And then we'll work, as we said, with the other sections.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
thanks for tolerating my, and I do not want to imply that this was a bad piece of work. I thought it was, as I said in my note, I thought it was a lot of good content in here. Just hard to pull some of it out.
I've looked at a lot of different cities, some the same size, some smaller, some much larger, and looking at their comprehensive plans online, and I've read till my eyes were. And I just go back to, for example, Asheville's comprehensive plan, and they asked the question of why is this happening? And their statement is the comprehensive plan is a community official document establishing policies for its long-range development. So we're saying that's not what we want to do with our comprehensive plan.
No, that's not what I'm saying. If you recall from one of the earlier slides, the third bullet establishes a policy framework to guide growth and development. I mean, that bullet seems very consistent with the statement that Asheville has made as well. And so as the details of the land use section, there's been plenty of feedback about some things that could change, but it takes I'll say a growth sector's approach to how we want to grow from a land use perspective. And so that particular section is probably the biggest policy statement that we're making about how we want to grow. And if you were to look at the growth sector maps, it's proposing different areas where we're intended to have growth, areas where we're not intended to have growth, and areas where we're trying to be very deliberate about how much growth we allow in certain areas of town. And so that very much is, from my perspective, a policy statement and some direction around growth. Now, what you won't see is a lot of information about use types or land use types, and that's because with a UDO that is intended to be more of a form-based code, you generally start to get away from a lot of use-based discussions, and it very much gets into design, orientation, community fit, and just character elements that are less about use. So hopefully that at least kind of offered a staff perspective. Yes, sir.
But again, back to your point on that bullet, it establishes a policy framework. It doesn't establish policies, just framework that then the policies are derived from that framework. You're not going to find the policy in the living document because, again, it's a living document. The policies just kind of are children of that document, essentially, would be the best way to look at that.
Right. So think about these 8 areas, and let me make sure I'm counting, getting this right, 8. So think about the 8 areas as the framework. It's the what. These are the 8 areas that we've said as a community at large, these are very important areas to the community. So if we're, as staff or anyone else, is off working on things that don't somehow fall into these 8 areas, we can quickly assess whether or not we're moving in a direction that is consistent with what the comp plan said. Now the second part of this, so that's the what. The second part is the how. Okay, well the how starts to get into individual policies around the different areas. So transportation, and some of that has shown up in the form of these key recommendations. So develop an updated transportation plan. So within that transportation plan, you may find Waxhaw is a community dedicated to supporting multimodal transportation, multimodal forms of transportation, bikes, cars, pedestrians, the full gamut. Right, transit, and so that within itself that is very specific policy statement around transportation. Okay, well, how are we going to do that? We're going to adopt regulations that would provide for streets that have all of these elements included. Okay, on the publicly funded side, we're going to identify projects that we can undertake that will improve pedestrian accessibility. Well, that's a way in which you're meeting the policy objective. When do we do all that? Well, that starts to get into prioritization, because there may be 40 different things that or tasks that we could do to support a transportation policy objective that feeds back into the broader comprehensive plan or policy framework. And that level of prioritization is what kind of resembles the conversations the board had primarily with the manager at the second day of the retreat. Is that helpful? Let me check in. Is that, or did I?
It's good for me. I guess my question then would be back again to the, I guess kind of reading into what the mayor was saying then. So we've got these in place. Is there a staff level assessment of where our current ordinances are? And are we doing anything, like you said, okay, so we're support multimodal, pedestrians, bicycles, cars. Do we have policies or ordinances in place that are against that at this time? And is there a staff level assessment going on to say, yeah, you've got a policy that says, you've got a vision or a comprehensive plan that says this, but then you've got ordinances that are contradicting that. Do we have that going on at any point?
I'm sure you could find some cases where there's some conflicts. I don't want to suggest that there aren't cases. For the specific multimodal example, I don't think we have anything that's conflicting in our ordinance language. What I'd say is we may not have a lot of documentation of whether it be ordinances or policies that say we're in support of that. On the planning side, you'll see the area plans that make probably the strongest statement about those types of things, a downtown neighborhoods plan or a Highway 16 corridor plan, and you will see information in those smaller area plans that would imply that this is the direction that we're trying to move, but those are targeted for very specific areas. Broadly as a town, I don't think we have anything that's really saying broadly as a town, here's where we want to be. Now, as a practical matter, is it being addressed on a pretty case by case basis right now? It's being addressed. The set of construction standards that I've been working on, that I'm due to receive a draft pretty soon, part of the street sections in that construction standards document would account for things like bike lanes, planting strips, and so there's the implementation piece that we are trying to catch it there, recognizing that we're catching it there without a lot of clean policy guidance that, hey, here's exactly where we want to get to. And a large part of how we got there, quite frankly, is through feedback in the comp plan. So you'll see, it's probably not here, but in the comp plan there is some dialogue about being much more multimodal friendly in Waxhaw. And so that's kind of how we're grabbing at some policy direction and going straight to this implementation phase, the construction standards. It's a very long-winded answer, but trying to show you how the dots are connected.
That's a great example. So he's working on street design standards, building in sidewalks and that lane strip, bike lanes, building those things in, because we got it out of the document, we got the direction from the comp plan. Those are priorities. That's where this is starting to be a policy.
Right, and so to follow this example, to hopefully to illustrate how you can have multiple policies, but they're different levels of detail. Comp plan, high level. We've established it's a growth. It can be used for kind of a growth framework, but it's a high level policy. Transportation, we'll keep picking on that as a section. What you can have, and maybe even some communities would have, is in their transportation plan, which some will call that's their policy document around transportation. You would have certain street types called out. So for every thoroughfare, all of our thoroughfares, we want 5-foot bike lanes, we want 8-foot planting strips, we want minimum 6-foot sidewalks. That's pretty detailed. In the comp plan, we're just saying we want to address multimodal transportation issues. We want to look at it comprehensively. So that's the high level. Now, at a more detailed level, well, thoroughfares should look like A. Collector streets should look like B. That's what a transportation plan, or again, transportation policy would do. Then, from an implementation perspective, we would have our construction standards and our ordinance language that's built to make sure that what's in that transportation plan can be implemented via the code. So right now, we're missing that interim piece, and there's a leap of faith being made between the comp plan direction or goals of multimodal transportation and the implementation piece. And a lot of that leap of faith, the gap is being covered, quite frankly, through some of the experience of staff, what's happening kind of throughout the region and other municipalities, what's happening throughout the country in terms of kind of multimodal transportation planning, quite frankly. So it's not absent of good logic, thought, and data. It's not connected directly to a Waxhaw specific transportation plan.
Dennis is working on filling that gap. And I'm gonna talk about that tonight about that. So,
And of course, I guess me, just logically, I jump to that we're teeing up Kensington Drive as a perfect opportunity for us to put our, I guess, our money where our mouth is, but demonstrate that us as a town can do what we say we want, what the town wants. Obviously, I guess Kensington will be a thoroughfare. I mean, by just looking at it, the cars that travel it, so how do we, again, I recall back to the old town hall and the lot behind it, if, for those that remember, used to be gravel. We put an ordinance in place that said we had to have, it couldn't be gravel because of what have you, and we had to go and pave it. And then we found out, well, no, actually we could have left it gravel. But again, I think it's a matter of the town showing that we put our money where our mouth is and we do what we want, what we demonstrate we're going to do. All right, thank you.
this has been great. I mean, this is good. This does provide us a start. Really get a lot of things in place. We need, like Mr. Thomas heard, we have absolutely got to get this right. And everything that flows from this is going to be based on this. Gotta get those other things right too. We need to be very
So, kind of wrapping it, Section 1 needs some work in terms of, because I think you heard from all of us that we have to get to what, not only purpose, but the story of Waxhaw.
Sure.
And then each of the 8 areas, we're going to take them, I guess, one by one. We're going to work them. And we're going to start with Studio Cascade next week.
Okay.
Is that? Yeah.
We're gonna take each area one at a time, because you don't eat the whole cow at one sitting.
Yeah, that's what I meant, one by one, yeah.
The branding consultant. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think it would make a lot of sense, add a lot of good value. If we're identifying some other community statements around who we are as Waxhaw, this is an excellent opportunity to make sure it goes into.
We could certainly pull in some of the content. We don't want to get one thing out in front of another, though, too. We'll get Earl's picture out of there and a few others, so. He left. Went to take another picture. Okay? All right.
Thank you.
Take a motion to adjourn. All those in favor? Aye. See you at 6:30.